Pregnant African teen at 14, Arab stepfather kicks her out, but her return leaves everyone stunned. At just 14 years old, Aliyah, a young African girl, found herself in the most terrifying situation of her life. Pregnant, alone, and abandoned by the very man who had promised to protect her. Malik, her wealthy Arab stepfather, had built an empire of luxury and power. But when he learned about her pregnancy, he didn't hesitate. He threw her out with nothing but the clothes on her back. What happened next, no one could have predicted. Years passed, and Aliyah struggled through pain, loss, and unimaginable hardship. But when she finally returns to the world of wealth and power that once rejected her, she brings a revelation so shocking that it will change everything. But what really happened in the years she was gone? And what will Malik do when he comes face to face with the child he once rejected? Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our powerful, life-changing stories. Aliyah sat in the cold, sterile bathroom of her stepfather's mansion, staring at the pregnancy test in her trembling hands. The 2 pink lines were unmistakable. Her breath hitched as fear wrapped around her chest like a vice. She was only 14. She had no idea how to be a mother, let alone how to tell Malik. She had lived in wealth and comfort ever since her mother Nadia married Malik 2 years ago. He was a powerful Arab executive, a man of influence in the business world. His mansion was filled with priceless art, marble floors, and chandeliers that cost more than most people's entire homes. But all of it felt meaningless now. Aliyah's mother had always warned her about making mistakes, about how their place in Malik's world was not as secure as it seemed. Malik had taken them in, provided for them, but there was always a distance, a coldness behind his generosity. He was not a cruel man, but he was not a father either. He had expectations, and Aliyah knew this was something he would never forgive. Her hands were clammy as she walked down the grand staircase. The weight of the secret pressed on her chest with every step. She found her mother in the sitting room, flipping through a fashion magazine. "Nadia," Aliyah whispered, her voice barely audible. Her mother looked up, noticing her pale face and wide eyes. "What is it?" Aliyah opened her mouth, but no words came. Instead, she held out the test with shaking hands. For a long moment, Nadia didn't move. Then slowly she took it, staring at the result as if willing it to change. A deep breath, then another. Finally, she looked up, her expression unreadable. "Who?" Aliyah swallowed hard. "It doesn't matter." "It does matter." Tears welled in Aliyah's eyes. "I can't tell you." Nadia stood up, pressing a hand to her forehead. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I didn't mean for this to happen." Malik's voice cut through the air like a blade. "What's going on?" Aliyah's breath caught in her throat. He stood in the doorway, his sharp gaze flicking between them. Nadia hesitated, but there was no hiding it now. She held up the test. The silence that followed was suffocating. Malik's jaw tightened, his knuckles turning white. "Tell me this is a joke." Aliyah forced herself to meet his gaze, even as every instinct told her to run. "It's not." His face darkened, a storm building behind his cold eyes. "You brought shame to this house." His voice was quiet, controlled, but filled with fury. "Malik, please," Nadia started, but he held up a hand. "Do you think I worked my whole life to build this? To bring you here, so you could throw it all away like this?" His gaze locked onto Aliyah. Who is the father? Aliyah didn't answer. Malik took a step forward. Answer me. She won't say, Nadia whispered. Malik exhaled sharply, shaking his head in disgust. Then it doesn't matter. You can't stay here. Aliyah's stomach dropped. What? You heard me? His voice was flat, emotionless. I won't have this under my roof. She's just a child, Nadia pleaded, stepping between them. She's old enough to make choices. Now she has to live with them. Aliyah's legs felt weak. You're throwing me out? Malik turned to Nadia. You want to help her? Go with her. Nadia's lips parted, but no words came. Aliyah saw the hesitation in her mother's eyes before she even spoke. I can't, Nadia whispered. Where would we go? How would we survive? The air left Aliyah's lungs. You're choosing him? Tears streamed down Nadia's face, but she didn't answer. Malik turned away. I want her gone by tonight. Aliyah stood frozen as the reality of his words sank in. Everything she knew, her home, her family, was slipping away. Nadia finally looked at her daughter. I'll help you pack. Aliyah didn't move. The weight of the betrayal, the sheer finality of it, crushed her. She was alone. The night air was unforgiving as Aliyah stepped out of the mansion that had been her home for the past 2 years. The grand gates loomed behind her, sealing her out as if she had never belonged. She clutched a small duffel bag, the only thing her mother had packed for her, while the cold wind bit into her skin. Her mother had barely looked at her as she handed her the bag. She hadn't fought for her, hadn't tried to stop Malik, hadn't even walked her to the door. Aliyah stood frozen on the sidewalk, staring at the long, empty road ahead. She had nowhere to go, no money, no plan. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to cry. She turned and started walking. The streets of Los Angeles felt different at night, harsher, unforgiving. She had never had to navigate them alone. The world outside Malik's mansion had always seemed distant, something she only glimpsed through car windows. Now, she was part of it. She walked for what felt like hours, her feet aching, her stomach twisting with nausea. She had nowhere to go, no one to call. Her phone had been taken. Malik had made sure of that. She thought about going to the police, but what would she say? That her stepfather had thrown her out? That she was 14 and pregnant? What could they do? The city felt like a beast swallowing her whole. At some point, exhaustion took over, and she sank onto a bench at a dimly lit bus stop. The streets were quiet except for the occasional car speeding past. Her hands cradled her stomach. You're all I have, she whispered. The thought terrified her. A car slowed down nearby, and her entire body tensed. Hey! A voice called out. She looked up to see a man leaning out of the window of an old sedan. He looked to be in his 20s, his eyes dark with something she didn't trust. You okay? He asked, his gaze sweeping over her. She didn't answer. He smirked. A girl like you shouldn't be out here alone. Aliyah stood quickly, gripping her bag. Relax, he chuckled. Just saying you should be careful. You never know who might take advantage of you. He drove off, laughing to himself. Aliyah's heart pounded. She needed to find somewhere safe. She started walking again, moving faster this time, her pulse racing. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every person she passed felt like danger. By the time she reached a rundown neighborhood, her legs were shaking. The neon glow of a 24-hour diner flickered ahead. She hesitated before stepping inside. The warmth hit her instantly, a stark contrast to the cold outside. The place was nearly empty, except for an old man nursing a cup of coffee at the counter and a tired-looking waitress wiping down a table. Aaliyah slid into a booth at the back, hoping no one would notice her. Her stomach growled, but she had no money. Minutes passed, then an hour. She must have dozed off because the next thing she knew, the waitress was standing beside her, arms crossed. "You all right, kid?" Aaliyah blinked. "Yeah. I just—" The woman sighed. "You got somewhere to be?" Aaliyah hesitated. The waitress looked her over, her gaze softening slightly. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but you shouldn't be out here alone." Aaliyah's throat tightened. "I don't have anywhere to go." The woman didn't ask any more questions. She just nodded and walked away. A moment later, she returned with a plate of scrambled eggs and toast, setting it down in front of Aaliyah. "Eat." Aaliyah's hands trembled as she picked up the fork. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite hit her tongue. The waitress sat across from her. "Name's Linda." Aaliyah swallowed. "Aaliyah." Linda watched her for a moment. "You got family?" Aaliyah shook her head. "Not anymore." Linda sighed. "Figured." She tapped her fingers on the table. "Look, I don't know your story, but I've seen enough kids come through here with nowhere to go. Some end up fine. Some—" She trailed off. Aaliyah didn't ask what she meant. She already knew. Linda stood. "You can stay in the back for the night, but just for tonight." Aaliyah looked up, stunned. Linda shrugged. "Better than the streets." Aaliyah nodded, her throat too tight to speak. For the first time since she had been thrown out, she didn't feel completely alone. Aaliyah woke up to the distant hum of traffic and the faint clatter of dishes from the diner's kitchen. The small storage room where Linda had let her sleep smelled of coffee beans and old cardboard, but it was warm, safer than the streets. She sat up, rubbing the stiffness from her neck. Her stomach growled, reminding her of how little she had eaten. Linda appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "Morning." Aaliyah managed a small nod. Linda sighed. "I shouldn't be doing this, but you're just a kid." She tossed a folded $20 bill onto the crate beside Aaliyah. "That's all I can spare. It'll get you some food, maybe a bus ride." Aaliyah's fingers tightened around the bill. "Thank you." Linda hesitated. "Listen, kid. You need to find someone who can help you. A shelter, a church, something." Aaliyah's chest tightened. "I can take care of myself." Linda scoffed. "Yeah? And how long do you think that'll last?" She exhaled sharply. "Look, I ain't gonna lecture you, but if you stay out there too long, bad things happen. Real bad." Aaliyah knew Linda was right. She had barely made it through one night. She stuffed the money into her pocket and stood. "I should go." Linda didn't stop her. Outside, the city was already awake. People rushed past, lost in their own lives. No one looked at her. No one cared. She wandered the streets, clutching her bag. She had no plan, no destination. Her mother's face flashed in her mind, the way she had just stood there while Malik threw her out. Aaliyah swallowed back the lump in her throat. She had spent years trying to be the perfect daughter, trying to fit into Malik's world. But the moment she became inconvenient, he had erased her like she was nothing. She would prove him wrong. She wouldn't beg. She wouldn't crawl back. She would survive. But survival was harder than she thought. By midday, the hunger had returned with a vengeance. She used some of Linda's money to buy a sandwich from a convenience store, eating it on a bench outside. She had no idea what to do next. Then she saw him, a man in a tailored suit, stepping out of a sleek black car in front of a high-end hotel. He looked Arab, wealthy, important. For a second, she thought it was Malik. Her heart pounded, but when the man turned, she realized he was a stranger. Still, the sight of him made her stomach twist. It reminded her of everything she had lost. She looked down at herself, her wrinkled hoodie, the dirt on her shoes. She didn't belong in that world anymore. Maybe she never had. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "Hey." She turned. A young man stood nearby, maybe 18 or 19, with messy blonde hair and sharp eyes. He was watching her too closely. "You new around here?" Aaliyah tensed. She had seen guys like him before, lingering near bus stations and street corners. She ignored him and stood to leave. "Whoa, relax." He held up his hands. "Just trying to help." She hesitated. He nodded toward her bag. "You homeless?" She said nothing. He smirked. "Figured. You don't have to be. I know a place." Aaliyah's pulse quickened. "I'm not stupid." He laughed. "Didn't say you were. But trust me, the streets are worse. People like you? They don't last out here." Aaliyah gritted her teeth. He leaned in slightly. "I can take you somewhere safe." Aaliyah's stomach twisted. Every instinct screamed at her to run. She took a step back. His smirk faded. "Suit yourself. But don't say I didn't warn you." She turned and walked away quickly, her heart hammering. She didn't look back. She had escaped one danger. But she had a sinking feeling there were worse ones waiting. Aaliyah walked fast, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The man's words stayed with her, echoing in her head. "People like you don't last out here." She hated that he might be right. Her feet ached, her body exhausted from a night of restless sleep, but stopping wasn't an option. The city felt too big, too dangerous. She needed to think, to find a plan, but hunger and fear clouded her mind. She passed by a row of shops, her reflection flickering in the windows. She barely recognized herself. Just 2 days ago, she had slept in a luxury mansion. Now, she was just another girl on the streets, invisible to the world. Then she saw it, a women's shelter across the street. A sign in the window read, "Help for young mothers." Her chest tightened. She hesitated, staring at the door. Could she do it? Could she walk in and admit she had nowhere else to go? She took a deep breath and crossed the street. Inside, the air smelled of old furniture and cleaning supplies. A receptionist sat behind a desk, flipping through papers. She glanced up when Aaliyah stepped in. "Can I help you?" Aaliyah's throat was dry. I need somewhere to stay." The woman's expression softened. "Are you pregnant?" Aaliyah nodded. The woman grabbed a clipboard and motioned toward a worn-out chair. "Fill this out, sweetheart." Aaliyah's fingers trembled as she took the clipboard. The questions felt invasive. Name, age, emergency contact. She hesitated at that one. She had no one to call. She left it blank. After a few minutes, the woman returned. "We don't have many beds open, but we can let you stay for a few nights. You'll have to meet with a caseworker in the morning." Aaliyah exhaled, relief washing over her. The woman led her down a dimly lit hallway to a small shared room. A few other young women sat on bunk beds, their faces tired, their eyes guarded. "This is temporary," the woman reminded her. "We'll figure something out." Aaliyah nodded. As the door closed behind her, she sat on the edge of the bed, gripping her bag. She had a roof over her head. For now. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. Somewhere out there, Malik and her mother were still living in their perfect world, pretending she never existed. And for the first time since being thrown out, Aaliyah felt something new. Not just fear, anger. She would survive. And one day, they would have to face her again. The shelter was quiet that night, but Aaliyah couldn't sleep. The mattress beneath her was thin, and every creak of the old building made her tense. The other girls in the room had long since fallen asleep, their slow, steady breathing the only sound in the darkness. She stared at the ceiling, her mind spinning. Malik had erased her. Her mother had chosen him over her own daughter. And now she was here, in a room full of strangers, clutching her stomach as if that alone would protect her from the world outside. She thought about running, about leaving the shelter before anyone could tell her what to do. But where would she go? Morning came too soon. A knock on the door jolted her upright. A staff member, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, peeked in. "Aaliyah? Caseworker wants to see you." Aaliyah hesitated before swinging her legs over the side of the bed. She was used to being told what to do. Malik had spent years shaping her into something quiet, obedient. But she wasn't that girl anymore. The caseworker's office was small, crowded with filing cabinets and a cluttered desk. A woman with graying hair and glasses motioned for her to sit. "I'm Miss Carter," she said, flipping through Aaliyah's intake form. "You've been through a lot." Aaliyah didn't respond. Ms. Carter glanced up. "You're young and pregnant. That means you need a plan." Aaliyah clenched her fists. "I don't have one." Ms. Carter leaned back. "Then let's make one." Aaliyah hesitated. She didn't want to depend on anyone. She had learned the hard way that people left, that people made promises they didn't keep. "I can get you into a long-term program," Ms. Carter continued. "Safe housing, job training, medical care. But I need to know you're willing to accept help." Aaliyah's chest tightened. She thought about Malik, about how he had looked at her as if she were nothing. She thought about her mother, about the way she had stood frozen, unwilling to fight for her. They had left her to survive on her own, and she would. She lifted her chin. "What do I have to do?" Ms. Carter smiled slightly. "We start small, a doctor's appointment, a support group. And if you want, we can look for your father's family." Aaliyah stiffened. Her father was a ghost, a name she had barely heard growing up. He had died before she was born. Malik had never let her ask about his family. He had made sure she believed there was no one else. But what if that wasn't true? What if she wasn't as alone as she thought? She swallowed hard. "I want to find them." Ms. Carter nodded. "Then we'll start there." For the first time in days, Aaliyah felt something other than fear. She felt hope. Malik had cast her out, but she wasn't done yet. Aaliyah sat in the small office, her hands clenched into fists. The idea of finding her father's family had once felt impossible. Malik had always dismissed the topic, telling her that there was no one left. That part of her life had been erased before she even had the chance to know it. But Ms. Carter had resources, connections, and in just a few days, she had found something. "There's someone who might be able to help," Ms. Carter said, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. Aaliyah hesitated before picking it up. A name was written in neat handwriting. Isaiah Reed. Her pulse quickened. "Who is he?" Ms. Carter folded her hands. "Your father's half-brother." He's been looking for you, Aaliyah. The air left her lungs. That's not possible, she whispered. Ms. Carter nodded toward the phone on the desk. He wants to talk to you. Aaliyah's fingers trembled as she reached for the receiver. She hesitated, then took a deep breath and dialed. The line rang once, twice. Then a deep voice answered. Hello? Aaliyah's throat tightened. Is this Isaiah Reed? A pause, then a sharp intake of breath. Aaliyah? Her stomach flipped. He knew her name. I don't know what to say, she admitted. Isaiah exhaled, his voice thick with emotion. I've been looking for you for years. Tears burned her eyes. Malik told me I didn't have any family. Silence, then a low, controlled anger in his voice. That man took you from us. Aaliyah swallowed hard. You knew about me? Isaiah's voice softened. Your father was my brother. When he passed, we tried to find you, but your mother married Malik, and then you disappeared. Aaliyah's breath shook. All this time, she had believed she was alone. But she wasn't. I want to meet you, she whispered. Isaiah didn't hesitate. Tell me where you are. I'll come to you. Aaliyah gripped the phone tighter. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but she knew one thing. She couldn't keep running forever. Her past had been stolen from her. Now, she was taking it back. Aaliyah stood at the entrance of the mansion she had once called home. The massive iron gates loomed before her, unchanged, just as cold and unwelcoming as the night she had been thrown out. But this time, she wasn't the scared 14-year-old girl who had begged to stay. This time, she wasn't alone. Beside her stood Isaiah Reed, her father's brother. A man she had never known existed until days ago. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with quiet authority. His presence alone gave her a strength she hadn't realized she needed. Isaiah glanced at her. Are you sure about this? Aaliyah exhaled. I need to do this. With that, she pressed the intercom button. Minutes passed before the gate buzzed open. She stepped forward, her heart hammering. Inside, everything was exactly as she remembered. The pristine gardens, the marble driveway, the towering house that had once been her prison. But she wasn't here to admire it. A servant opened the door, eyes widening when she saw Aaliyah. Miss... Where's Malik? Aaliyah interrupted. The woman hesitated, then stepped aside. He's in his office. Aaliyah walked inside, Isaiah right behind her. The hallways were eerily quiet. She could hear her own footsteps echoing against the polished floors. She reached the office door and pushed it open without knocking. Malik was seated behind his grand mahogany desk, dressed in his usual tailored suit, exuding the same air of power and control he always had. But the moment his eyes met hers, something shifted. His fingers stiffened around the pen in his hand. For the first time, she saw shock on his face. Aaliyah, he said, his voice controlled, but his eyes flicked to Isaiah. What is this? Aaliyah didn't sit. She didn't lower her gaze. You lied to me, she said. You told me I had no family. Malik's expression darkened. I did what was best for you. No, Aaliyah snapped. You did what was best for you. You threw me away like I was nothing. Malik's jaw clenched. You were 14 and pregnant. Do you expect me to apologize for not letting you disgrace this family? Isaiah took a step forward. You stole her from us. Malik's gaze shifted to him, cold and calculating. I saved her. Aliyah let out a bitter laugh. Saved me. You abandoned me, left me on the streets with nowhere to go. Do you have any idea what I went through? Malik leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. You survived. Aliyah's hands balled into fists. She had come here for closure, to show him that he had failed to break her. But now, standing in front of him, she realized something. She didn't need anything from him. Not his guilt, not his apology. He was nothing to her. Aliyah turned to leave, but then her mother's voice stopped her. Aliyah? She froze. Nadia stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes filled with disbelief. Aliyah swallowed the lump in her throat. Mom. Nadia took a shaky step forward. You're here. Aliyah met her gaze, searching for something, regret, love, anything. Nadia's hands trembled. I wanted to find you. I didn't know where to look. Aliyah's chest tightened. You let him throw me out. Tears welled in Nadia's eyes. I was scared. Aliyah shook her head. No, you were weak. Nadia let out a soft sob. I never stopped thinking about you. Aliyah felt the weight of her mother's pain, but it didn't change the truth. You had a choice, Aliyah said quietly. And you didn't choose me. Silence stretched between them. Isaiah placed a hand on Aliyah's shoulder. Let's go. Aliyah took one last look at the house, the life she had lost. Then she turned and walked away. This time, she was leaving on her own terms. And for the first time in years, she felt free. Aliyah sat on the couch, watching Zara build a tower with her blocks. The sound of her daughter's laughter filled the small but cozy apartment. It wasn't a mansion, and it wasn't lavish, but it was theirs. Isaiah had helped her build this life. He had given her what Malik never had, unconditional family. She had spent years carrying the weight of her past, but as she looked at Zara, she realized something. She wasn't running anymore. She had survived, and she had won. Months later, Aliyah stood outside the cemetery, staring at the gravestone with Malik's name carved into it. He had died suddenly. A heart attack in his office. She had debated coming. In the end, she wasn't here for him. She was here for herself. She placed a single white flower on the grave, not out of love, not out of forgiveness, but because she refused to let his shadow define her anymore. I'm free, she whispered, turning away for the last time. And this time, she never looked back. If this story touched your heart, remember, strength is built in the hardest moments. No matter where you come from, no matter who tries to break you, you are more than your past. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because survival isn't just about making it through, it's about rising above.